And if you need a book, Barry has books. Raise your hand if you need one of those. We are in Lesson 5, the Furnace of Fire. If you've got your book and want to turn to that lesson. Before we get started, if we could, Johnny, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer? Thank you, Johnny. We kind of started, I guess they divided this lesson into two parts. And with last week's lesson, Eric talked about the statue itself, and he worked really hard not to step on my lesson, and I appreciate that. I can't say that I would have been that nice to him, but I appreciate Eric doing that. But he talked about the statue and how Nebuchadnezzar built this statue, and I'd always kind of in my mind thought it was an image of him, but the Bible doesn't specify that. I guess maybe just seeing pictures growing up when you study this lesson, it's always a picture of a big bearded statue, and just assume that it was an idol of him. But it was an idol, and Israel, that was kind of their go-to sin, you might say. You know, if you had a list of the things that Israel had a problem with as far as sin, idolatry would probably be at the top of that list. If you look at their history, they were just constantly going away from God and towards idolatry. There was like they were pulled constantly to do that. Jackie? Sure. Yeah, and so they were constantly pulled in that direction. And I guess when you think about why maybe that was, idolatry is sort of an easy path, isn't it? Because you can make an idol do whatever you want, or have whatever religious doctrine you want it to have. If you build it yourself and you're making up the rules, well, you can do it to suit yourself. If you want to have as many wives as you want, I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to, you could have an idol that they said that was okay. And so basically idolatry was serving themselves. It was serving their own pleasures and their own needs. And here is another chance for these Jews to go towards idolatry. And no doubt the majority of them did that, and did so willingly, which makes it all the more impressive that these three young men chose not to do that. Johnny, did you have something? Sure. Good point. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so even in religion today, we don't see as much idolatry, although there is some, but doing things my way, how I want to worship God. Whether it's I want to be entertained, or I want to do what's convenient for me, what makes me feel good. Certainly you see that. So we were introduced to these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, back in chapter 1, and when we first meet them, they are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as you might recall from our first lesson, the Chaldeans, one of the first things they did was they changed their names. And they changed their names from names that meant things like Hananiah meant the Lord is gracious. And it was changed to Shadrach, which means I am fearful of the God. Mishael meant who is what God is, and his Babylonian name, Meshach, means I am of little account, and Azariah, whose Hebrew name meant the Lord has helped me, was changed to Abednego, which meant servant of the god Nebo, Nebo being one of the Chaldean gods. And so at least a couple of them changed specifically from names alluding to Jehovah God to names that alluded to specific God or just the gods of the Chaldeans in general. And that was all part of that 3-year indoctrination that these young Jews went through. Remember, those three, along with Daniel, and I'm sure there were others, were specifically chosen to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's house. They were chosen because they were smart, they were young, they were good looking, they picked up on things quick, they were quick to learn, chapter 1 says, and so they had their names changed. They were taught the culture of the Chaldeans. They were taught the religion of the Chaldeans. They were taught the language of the Chaldeans. Everything that Nebuchadnezzar could do to indoctrinate them and cause them really to lose their identity, to forget about the religion that they had and the culture that they had and adopt the culture of the Chaldeans in order to serve in his house. And of course, you'll remember in chapter 1 that they refused to partake of the food in Nebuchadnezzar's house and stood firm in their resolve not to defile themselves. And we talked about the faith that they had and the courage that it took to...
We all know that utility companies expect to be paid for providing power to your installation. Square D Metering offers...
And we're going to see that again in our lesson this morning in chapter 3. And so... Sure. And as we study this, I think we would all, and we all know the story, how that they were faithful and they served God and refused to bow down before the image. And we'd all like to put ourselves in their shoes and think and hope that we would do the same thing, right? And yet many times we don't show the same faith that they showed, even when our life isn't on the line. We may show a lack of faith, even if it's having a conversation with a coworker or going out with friends and not showing the right faith and the right respect for God. And yet these three young men had a lot more on the line than that, and we're going to see the faith that they had. So let's look at our actual text. Of course, last week we talked about the image. Eric did a good job covering that, and I think we left off in verse 12 where these people who were probably jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in all likelihood they were Chaldeans themselves who maybe they'd been passed over for opportunities, like I think Eric mentioned last week. And there's always people that are going to be watching us and trying to catch us in a slip-up, trying to catch us making a mistake, especially when it comes to religious things. If we profess something, that we're going to be kind of held under a microscope. And these people were quick to go and point out to Nebuchadnezzar that they're not serving the gods, your gods. They don't worship the gold image. They're in verse 12. And so that gets us to verse 13, where Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" So even in those verses, you can see the arrogance that Nebuchadnezzar has. Not only the arrogance that he had in building the statue to begin with, but he can't fathom that these people, these Jews, these lowly Israelites, wouldn't do what he told them to do. So in his mind, it seems it must have been that they didn't get the message, that they don't understand, Maybe they weren't ready. Maybe they didn't get what was going on. And so I'm going to give them another chance because I just can't fathom that they would blatantly disobey me. Nebuchadnezzar being probably the most powerful man in the world at this time. And I've got to imagine he probably felt pretty good about himself giving them another chance. He probably thought, man, I'm being really generous to these poor Jews, to not kill them right now, but to give them another chance to do the right thing and bow down to this image I've made. And you can just see the pride that he's got. And you notice the difference in the pride that he has and the lack of pride that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to have. You know, these three men, these three Jews, had risen in the kingdom of the Chaldeans. In the last verse of chapter 2, Daniel had become chief administrator, and he petitioned the king who set them over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So they had got some power. And anytime somebody gets power, there's always that risk that it's going to go to their head, right? And that they're going to become lifted up in pride. And we've seen people that they just get a tiny bit of power and it goes straight to their head and they can't handle it. But these young men, that didn't happen to. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of power. And he knew it, and he enjoyed it, and you're going to see that he even thought that he was more powerful than the gods he served. Because you notice he said, "Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Well, in the previous chapter, he had recognized that the God of the Jews, he said, "This is God of the gods." So on one hand, he's already recognized that God is more powerful than any of the other gods that he recognized. But here in this chapter, he says, even so, who's the God that's going to deliver you from my hands? So essentially, he's saying, I'm more powerful even than these gods that I supposedly serve. And I think part of the issue, and we touched on last week, why is it that he keeps going back? Why did he, on the one hand, say, I'm a believer in God. God is God of the gods. And now he's not even recognizing God's power at all. I think part of the power, his pride keeps getting in the way, and also he says God of the gods. He doesn't say Jehovah's the one true God. Jehovah's the only God. He still thinks God is just one of many gods. And it sort of reminds me of the heart in the parable of the sower. There was the stony soil, and what happens? Sows the seed, and it springs up real quick. And it's all about emotion, and there's really no root to that heart. Nebuchadnezzar seems to me like that way. He sees some evidence of what God can do, whether it's Daniel revealing a vision or whether it's these three young men not being consumed in a fire. And he's quick to say, oh, God is powerful. And God is the best God, but he doesn't have any root in the faith, and it doesn't last. So the answer that they give beginning in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So rather than apologize and back down and go the easy route, it would certainly have been easier to follow all the other Jews that were bowing down to this image. It would have been a lot easier to just say, just kind of go along to get along. And bow down and be done with it. They refused. And when we studied this lesson as kids, the lesson was always Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were threatened to be consumed in the fiery furnace if they didn't obey God, or if they didn't bow down. And because of their great faith, they knew that God would deliver them, and so they didn't bow down and they were saved. That's not exactly reality. reality is that they weren't 100% sure God was going to see them through, that God was going to deliver them. They recognized that He had the power to, He had the ability to, but they also recognized that God might choose not to deliver them. And there's a big difference in that, to me. You know, it's one thing to say when we're going through a trial, God's going to see me through this. You know, if we go through sickness and we say, God's going to see me through this, or we go through a relationship issue and say, God's going to see me through this. That's fine. That's good to have that faith, but it's a different faith to say, God can see me through this, but even if He chooses not to, I'm still going to be faithful to Him. Because people get sick, and God chooses not to have them get better. People go through relationship issues, and things don't always work out for the best. But are we still going to be faithful to Him, even if things don't work out the way we want to? And it seems like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had that attitude. We know God can, but even if He doesn't, we're still not bowing down to this image that you've created. Jackie? Sure. Sure. Absolutely. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 4. If you want to turn there, there's some verses where Peter points out that we are going to suffer and go through trials, and shouldn't be surprised when that happens. 1 Peter 4, beginning in verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part He is blasphemed, but on your part He is glorified. Now, those are easy verses for me to stand up here and read, but they're a lot harder when that actually happens, when we go through those trials and we actually have to have the faith to say, I don't know that things are going to work out for the best here on earth. I know things are going to work out for the best eternally if I'm faithful to God, but things don't always go our way on earth, and didn't even for some of the great heroes of faith. Let's look at another chapter. Let's look at Hebrews 11, a chapter that's familiar to us because we talk about the faith and the heroes of faith that are in this chapter, and usually we point out people like Abraham and Moses that did great things and showed great faith, and good stuff happened to them. But there's also some people mentioned here that did good things, showed great faith, and bad things happened to them. And we need to be aware of that too. Starting in verse 32, the writer says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again." So to this point it sounds pretty good, right? You show great faith, stay faithful to God, good things happen to those people. But then right in the middle of verse 35 kind of turns the other directions. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. And we like to point out, for example, Abraham and the faith that he had, because it makes us feel good that we can say he had this great faith, and look how much he was blessed here on earth. Great nations. He had great wealth personally. We sometimes don't mention somebody like Stephen, who also had great faith, but he died a martyr. And I don't point these verses out to be negative, but just to show us and kind of reinforce how much faith I think these three young men had in not bowing down to this image, because just as easily as God delivered them, he could have allowed them to perish. If that had been his will and that had suited his eternal purpose, they could have died a martyr just like somebody like Stephen did. And so for them to say, God can deliver me, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down to this image, to me is so much more powerful than what I always got out of this lesson, which was I'm positive I have 100% faith that God's going to deliver me, and that's why I'm not going to be bow down. And so that's the difference that I see. And I think it gets down to our motivation in serving God. Remember in Job chapter 1, when God pointed out to Satan, "Consider my servant Job," what did Satan accuse God of doing? Protecting. Yeah. Why wouldn't he serve you? You built a hedge around him. You've given him everything he could want. Why would he not serve you? But if you take away those things and you make life hard for him, he'll curse you to your face. That's what Satan told God. So Satan, in this essence, was accusing Job of having this type of faith that was, as long as God is doing good things for me, I'll be obedient to him. But when things get hard, I won't. That's what Satan thought. Satan was obviously wrong, because God still didn't, or Job still didn't deny him even when those terrible things happened to him. W.A.? And he still wouldn't do it. So his motivation for obedience was not some kind of shallow, hey, whatever, as long as things are going good, I'm going to be faithful. It was a deeper love for God than that. Exactly. Even when we're not being blessed like we think we should be or would like to be, even when we go through those issues of life, is our faith so shallow that we're going to fall away and we're going to ask God, why would you do this to me? Or are we going to stay resilient and reliant upon Him? It's all about our motivation. What is our motivation for serving God? Is it because I'm going to get out more than I give? Is it out of fear? Some people serve God out of fear. Or is it because we recognize that God loves us and that we love Him because of what He has done for us? And so it won't have time to read the rest of the chapter, but of course the three are delivered. They weren't harmed at all, and God did see them through and took care of them. And they maintained their integrity. They maintained their faith in God, their integrity, even in the face of death. And so as a motivation for us to maintain our integrity, and most of the time it won't be death that we're faced with. It may just be something much smaller. Maybe we're made fun of. Maybe it's the loss of a job if I'm faithful to what the truth is. Maybe I'm putting my social status at risk. But sometimes we let those things interfere, and we can point to this lesson hopefully as an example of people that didn't let anything get in their way of serving God. So, any other comments before we dismiss? But we do have a precedent that we can look at, and an example that we can look at to see that we can overcome those things. Appreciate those comments. Appreciate y'all being here. Thank you.